Good evening and welcome once again to the Tzemach Bible Institute program. I'm John Klein, and with me tonight as usual is Ken Garrison, pastor of Fellowship Church and founder of the Tzemach Bible Institute. Good evening, Ken.
Good evening, John.
Ken, I have a question for you tonight. Can the prayers of believers in this country change the direction of our nation? And the second question is, if so, is it our responsibility to pray?
John, certainly, I believe it is so. Jeremiah exhorted the people living in the exile to do so, and Paul followed the same thing in the letter to Timothy. And so this is spiritual warfare, and we're called to do so.
Okay, good. Now, listen, if we're called to do spiritual warfare, let's look at that scripture that defines spiritual warfare in Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. So, as believers, we're not supposed to go and change the direction of our government forcibly, but we could pray for the direction of the government, that they fulfill the will of God.
I believe that's what Paul outlined in his letter to the Ephesians, that we would
live quiet and peaceable lives.
We would do that and make known to the principalities the multifaceted purposes of God. We're going to propose that tonight. We're going to look at two things. First of all, the structure of, John read in that scripture, the world forces of this darkness. So we want to kind of look at the world forces tonight. And then secondly, look at a specific problem that is apparent at this particular time with a real deep spiritual problem with the American government, our government, and outline that for us. So we're going to, first of all, outline what in Paul's terminology, what he calls the world forces of this darkness. The first spiritual power or principality that I want to look at, and we're going to do this in diminishing size relative to global population. The first one is Islam, and which represents roughly 1/4 of the world population. We would say that Islam is a demonic oppression, a vision of resulting from demonic oppression that has been institutionalized now into a global religion. It has no central military force, at least at the present time, does not contribute to the economic engine of the world, with the exception of the exportation of oil. And John, I just to point out the how subtle this thing is about religion. Can we imagine how the struggle against communism would have been in this nation 50 years ago had communism been seen as a religion, and how we would have had to try to deal with that. So Islam represents formal world power, a global darkness.
Do we ever call any religion evil or anything? Do you ever see that on the world forces?
If it's evil, now from our perspective, and we're coming from a Christian, Jewish, biblical perspective, evil is something that counters what we see God doing, and so certainly we would call Islam evil because it is absolutely adamantly set to counter or destroy the biblical worldview.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, okay. Next, we want to look at China. Now, China is approximately 1/6 of the world's population. They are a rapidly growing military force. Now, they're an interesting case, Ken, because they are a communist dictatorship with a capitalistic economic system. And consequently, they have a rapidly growing economic force with all the cheap labor.
That's right. And so if the Lord tarries for another 20 or 30 years, obviously on the global scale scene, China is going to be a force, obviously, really to reckon with. It's that way today, but it's certainly growing. We want to look next at the United States. The United States represents about 1/20th of the global population. So you can see we've gone from a quarter and a sixth down to 1/20th, a very small fraction of world population. But evidently, at least from an apparent standpoint, the dominant military force in the world, and certainly the real primary economic engine of the whole world.
All right. Next, we want to look at Israel, and Israel is about 1/1000th of the world population, and they're minimal importance economically. I mean, their economy wouldn't affect anybody. On the other hand, and this is the key statement here, we believe they are the strongest, most potent military force in the world. Now, we need to clarify that with faith. In other words, if we believe the scriptures and we take into account things that God has spoken about Israel, and God doesn't change, so if these things were true in biblical times, they're true today. Scriptures like Isaiah 54, no weapon formed against you shall prosper. Ken, and every mouth that accuses you shall be silenced.
All right,
so that's still in effect.
All right, still in effect. So the statement that Israel is the most powerful or most potent military force in the world is obviously we're including a biblical perspective of the thing. John, read for us, if you would, Daniel 12:1. I believe there we talk about some of the spiritual backup. We're not just talking about so many divisions or so many tank units. We're talking about something beside tank units and army divisions.
Okay, now let's look at this for a second. There are 3 archangels mentioned in the Bible. Satan, the opposer, who has 1/3 of the demons according to Revelation 12 under his authority. Then there's Gabriel and Michael. All right? Gabriel's the one that came and spoke to Mary and to Joseph. Now, look at what this says. Daniel 12:1. Now at that time, Michael, the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people. In other words, Michael stands guard over the Jewish people, Ken.
So he would be like a military commander in the spiritual sense.
Yes.
All right, now, to fully illustrate what we're talking about here, and so that you don't just chuckle when you hear our statement, we're going to read a biblical account taken from 2 Kings in the times of the prophet Elisha. 2 Kings chapter 6. John, read that.
Now Elisha and his servants seem to be surrounded by the Syrians.
Syrian chariots.
Right.
It'd be like a tank division today.
Okay. So now when the attendant of the man of God, who's Elisha, as Ken said, had arisen early and gone out, behold, an army with horses and chariots were circling the city. And his servant said to him, Alas, my master, what shall we do? So he answered and said, Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. That's quite a statement when all you could see is
Syrian
chariots. And Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of the horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha.
So this is another component to the military of Israel that is normally not reckoned with. It's not visible, it's not apparent, but it's there.
So Elijah, seeing with spiritual eyes, then said, those that are with us are more than those that are with them.
And we would maintain that probably the time in our recent history when this was most evident was the 6-day war. And so certainly the whole tide of battle was abruptly changed, and Israel prevailed in a short period of time, which gave evidence to this phenomenon. Now, we've made assessment of what Paul called the world forces of this darkness. Now we want to change our focus a bit and look at a problem that is apparent in the between the people of the United States and the government of the United States that is uniquely apparent at the present time. And we're going to set forth a hypothesis that the government of the United States has literally been hijacked by globalists whose views differs greatly or almost diametrically opposite of that of the general population of the United States. We believe that the U.S. leadership has been corrupted by greed and power and riches and no longer reflects the very common the attitude of the common American.
And this is most generally illustrated by this conflict we have going on right now. This bold conflict, I might add. There seems to be the administration and Congress seem to have a strong push towards passing some sort of immigration bill without securing the borders, and the overall population in this country disagrees with that. Now, this is most emphasized by talk radio, who are pushing this point forward. There seems to be an element of terrorism in here, that not an immigration in itself, but just the legality, Ken. The rule of law or the rule, not what's expedient for the moment.
Yeah, I think that the idea of the population of America in general is that the government needs to enforce the very simple rule of law. We're not against immigration, obviously. This is a nation of immigrants. But nevertheless, whatever we're doing should be conducted in a legal proceeding. You mentioned the problem of terrorism. Obviously, immigration is related to the issue of terrorism. But more basically, the American public is adamant that our government should enforce the existing laws concerning our borders. Instead of doing that, our government seems to be prosecuting border agents and not the people that are breaking the law by coming across the border. And at the same time, are adamant about pursuing legislation that would grant legal status to the so-called 12 million or so people already here.
Right.
And the public is on one position, and it seemed. John just mentioned earlier that one of the local congressmen getting a lot of calls on this issue, and it was 98% was. Reflecting against the immigration bill that's now being debated in Congress, and Congress and the administration seems to be absolutely adamant about pursuing it.
Yeah, it seems like the Republicans, in support of business and cheap labor, want it, and the Democrats want it to increase their voting bloc. So regardless of what the people want, it seems they're pushing ahead. Now, they're also debating a bill or speaking about bringing back this every time somebody in radio then, which is dominated by conservative talk shows hosts, there will be an opposing view, Ken. So they're seeing, in other words, instead of obeying the will of the people, they're going to prosecute not only border guards, but talk show radio hosts.
Well, yeah. So instead of drafting legislation that would reflect the general view of the people and the American people, they're considering legislation or reenacting old legislation,
right,
as you point out, that would limit or throttle the dissent,
opposition
right, to it. So now we have a situation existing in the country where the government of the United States is proceeding seemingly absolutely adamantly, and this represents both political parties. There are some dissenting voices, but the administration and the leadership of Congress seems to be adamant to press forward in this thing, which is diametrically opposite the will and the view of the American people, which should not be the case. Now, no matter what our position may be on the issue of immigration, we want to use that today to use that as a springboard to come to another issue that we believe is much more important and much more consequential, but exactly the same thing exists. The government of the United States pursues a policy which is diametrically opposite that of the people.
And they keep using, I've heard the Congress people on TV saying, well, the people don't know all the intricacies of it, or they don't know what we know. And they use that as an excuse to push ahead with whatever they want, whatever's best for them or their particular party, and not the will of the people.
I'm not particularly fond of being called stupid myself.
So, but they do it constantly.
All right, now, so as I indicated a moment ago, we want to switch the focus now and go to what I believe is a much more consequential issue, and that is the relationship of this nation to Israel. And again, we will maintain that the globalist interest has dominated the U.S. government in regard to relationship to Israel. The official policy of the United States relative to Israel. Now, please listen to what I'm going to say because I think it's important. The policy of the United States government relative to Israel is, number one, morally unjust and is biblically unrighteous. Now, whether you're a believer or not, one or the other of those areas should get you. It's morally wrong, just plain morally wrong, and it's biblically would be considered plain unrighteous.
From a values point of view, Israel is probably closest to the United States in the whole world. Certainly in the Middle East, there's no doubt about that. Of what's right or wrong, they're closest to the United States.
Absolutely.
And we go to Israel, feel right at home, and Israelis come here, feel right at home, because it's the same type of moral values. And then again, as voting in the UN, there is no nation that votes as closely with the United States in the UN as Israel. So it's from that point of view, Ken, it's just unrighteous, unjust.
Right. Listen, if you look at Israel, Israel's a melting pot just like the United States is. Israel has a democratic government just like the United States is. Israel has a free market economy just like the U.S. Israel is under attack by Islamic terrorism just like the United States. We have a great deal more in common with Israel than any other nation. And you would think that our policy toward Israel would be extremely positive. And in fact, I would say that the American public in general, that is true, but our government is pursuing a policy detrimental to the nation. Now, from a biblical standpoint, that's just plain unrighteous, and because in addition to the moral just position of Israel, from a biblical standpoint, we see Israel as righteousness, and that's the reason that evangelicals in general are very supportive of Israel.
Right. Oh, but besides evangelicals, there's grassroots support for Israel in this nation, and it's very strong.
Sure.
There's a strong support for Israel in Congress, and less so in the Senate, and not at all in the administration, as Condoleezza Rice seems to try to manipulate and force Israel to take whatever position she thinks is best at the moment. An honest straw poll of the fiber of this nation would show that Israel would get much more support than any of the Muslim nations that would seek to destroy Israel. The American people would vote overwhelmingly in support of Israel.
I don't think there's any question about that. I think Americans in general respect the personal ethics and individual initiative and resolve of the average Israeli. And obviously, from a Bible-believing perspective, as a Christian, there is evidence of much faith in Israel, and obviously that's respected. Nevertheless, our policy reflects something different.
Okay. The administration undermines the sovereignty of the nation of Israel. They've even given money to political parties that were in opposition to the stated will of the Israeli people.
Sure.
To try and promote them. So not only did they do that, the administration is funding a terrorist state. They are giving arms and money to the Palestinian terrorist state. And so that's just morally wrong. Our official policy is madness. we are opposing Muslim terrorism everywhere in the world except Israel. We're working hard to establish a Muslim terrorist state in the midst of democratic Israel.
And this is not something new. It's been a long-standing policy of this country. I can remember, I believe the year was 1982, when Mr. Reagan intervened directly with Mr. Begin, who was then Israel's prime minister, and rescued Yasser Arafat and thousands of his gunmen who were rescued from sure destruction by the Israelis in Beirut and retreated to Algiers just to come to fight another day. And we most conservatives at least really honor Mr. Reagan, but he intervened personally and directly to stop the annihilation of what is the very daddy of Islamic terrorism, the PLO.
And as a result of that, we've been in turmoil since then, and Lebanon has been destroyed since then, and Israel has been fighting this terrorism, and it's spread to the whole world.
And again, this is not a new policy. If we back up a few years to the Six-Day War, coming into the Six-Day War, everybody understood that the overwhelming power, that's why we get to that military force again, they thought the overwhelming power of the much superior, seemingly superior Arab Muslim forces would easily overrun Israel and remove the Jewish problem altogether from the diplomatic issues. Something altogether different happened. America stood by, Europe stood by, while the Arab nations prepared to attack, and all of a sudden Michael must have stood up, and everything in a matter of 6 days was reversed. That's why we said earlier in the program that Israel has the most explosive and potent military force on the face of the earth, even though that's not apparent if you just compare divisions and tanks and aircraft.
Okay. Again, we want to say that we could see globalist interests, the dominant in U.S. policy, which is diametrically opposed, opposite of the opinion reflected by most Americans. So we have a globalist mindset in the leadership of this nation, whether it's pushing big business or military arms or whatever it is, that is diametrically opposed to your and my opinion. And so they're pushing ahead regardless.
Relative to Israel, John, I want to make the statement that I am absolutely convinced that the current policy being pursued by the current administration, and let me say again that we're not talking about a Republican Democratic thing, because this is something that transcends both parties. It doesn't really matter who's in power. They pursue exactly the same policy. The idea now is to create a military parity between the Arab Muslim states and Israel in order specifically to prevent something like the Six-Day War from happening again. Now, it's not going to work. When Michael stands up and the forces that Elisha saw on the mountains of Israel comes into play, then no weapon formed against Israel is going to prosper. Yep. And that would include U.S. weapons also. So we need to be aware of that. Now, we started out by talking about spiritual warfare. We have, as believers, a responsibility relative to spiritual warfare. We live in a nation where we believe, at least, that the biblical morals has been institutionalized in government, quite contrary to the Muslim governments. But the very basis of our Constitution and the founders of this nation was biblical righteousness. We now have a government that we would believe, has been usurped by globalists who are acting absolutely diametrically opposite to that basic biblical sense of the American people. Now our weapons are light and truth. Our responsibility as believers is to proclaim that.
Okay. About 750 years before Paul wrote in Romans 15:8, he writes that Messiah should be encouraging the Jewish people on behalf of the truth of the promises that God made to their fathers. 750 years prior to that, in Isaiah 49:5, Isaiah said exactly the same thing. And so we need to be, if we are believers in the scriptures, believers of the God of the Bible, we need to be encouraging the Jewish people to believe these promises that we've spoken about today, that God has promised them. We need to believe them. We need to encourage our government to believe them, and we need to encourage the Jewish people to believe them. Otherwise, we're going to wind up on the wrong end of this thing, Ken.
John, I want to say that I'm still optimistic that the basic biblical roots of this nation can still rise up, kick out the global interests that are controlling especially the executive branch, but the upper tiers of the legislative branch also, and do something about it.
Okay, Ken, there's going to be a conference in Washington pretty soon. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, Pastor John Hagee, who heads up the Christians United for Israel, is calling a meeting in D.C. July the 16th through the 19th. And the very purpose of this meeting is just exactly what we've been talking about today, to bring some reality to the administration and Congress relative to the nation of Israel.
Right. There is a contingent from our church going up there to join in that effort. We want to suggest that your church send a group up to join in that effort also. Be heard in this important day.
Absolutely. And we are doing this same thing here locally with this TV program, and across the world with the internet. So we are delighted with your support. From time to time, you send in financial support, and we delight to receive that too. And so we rejoice with support. One other thing that we do that's very, very important is take people up to the land of Israel just to experience what we've been talking about today. And John, you're getting ready to do that.
Right. Our trip to Israel is different than most trips in that we will spend 4 days of our 2-week tour in Judea and Samaria, seeing these people on the hilltops that God has brought back, people of faith, just like you and I. I invite you to call in, and I'll send you a brochure. Well, that's our program for this evening. Shalom.